The effects of climate change are apparent in Canada's north, and those changes bring with them both economic opportunities and challenges. Joining us now for more, in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, via Skype, Madeleine Redfern. She is the former mayor of Iqaluit, now the president of Ayungin Arctic Consulting Group. In the nation's capital, Frances Abel, professor of public policy and administration at Carleton University. And here in the studio, Anya Jeffrey, Director of Northern and Aboriginal Policy at the Conference Board of Canada, and Bernard Funston, former chair of the Canadian Polar Commission, now president of Northern Canada Consulting. Great to have everybody on the program today, a part of the country that we are happy to focus on, and we should be focusing on more because there's such exciting things happening, which we're going to get into now. Starting with, Mr. Director, if we can, a map. Let's just orient ourselves to the part of the country that we're going to be talking about. Yes, Canada's north, 3 territories, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And there are the capital cities as well. And I suppose for the purposes of this discussion, if we take that white line that borders the territories with the provinces to the south and take it straight across, we could be talking about northern Quebec and Labrador as well. So that's the part of the country we're going to be talking about. Let's also put some quick statistics on the table here just to give you a better sense of what's happening economically in the north. Canada's north accounts for nearly 40% of Canada's landmass, with Nunavut the largest territory at more than 2 million square kilometers. Over that huge landmass, the total population of the 3 territories is just slightly more than 100,000 people, and the majority of them Aboriginal. That's not including northern Quebec or Labrador. For the whole of Canada's north, expenditure-based GDP was more than $9 billion, which may seem like a lot, but that is less than 1% of Canada's GDP. Okay, let's get into this. For us in the south, of course, the news is that the climate in the Arctic is changing, the polar sea ice is melting. It leaves a confusing picture, perhaps, to some of us as to the range of, is this an environmental disaster, or does this present fantastic new economic possibilities? So let's get a better understanding of this. Madeleine, let's start with you. How do Northerners see the changes that are happening in the north?
It's important to realize that it is a lot more complicated than how it's often being described. The seasons are still, the vast majority of ice and snow. It may be freezing up a little later in some places. We actually had an issue of one of our communities was not able to get their sea lift in because of ice conditions over the course of the summer. So it is not just a simple question of having more open water. It's also a question of infrastructure and roads and buildings and making sure that they're stable.
Frances, how about you? How do you see things?
Of course, there will be opportunities with the changing climate, but there will also be significant costs. The ones I think about are infrastructure costs, because the construction that exists now, especially in the Arctic, depends upon permafrost. And in the long run, the permafrost is going to melt.
Bernie, how about you? How do you see it?
Much like Fran, there are 3 kinds of ice to be worried about. The one that we all hear about is the sea ice. It's melting. It's going to have regional and local effects. There's another kind of ice, which is land-based ice. Greenland, for example, contains enough fresh water to raise the oceans about 7 meters if it all melts. The effects of that melting is far more global because it not only raises sea levels, it has the potential to, for example, affect the thermohaline circulation patterns of the ocean. And then there's a third kind of ice, which is land-based ice, permafrost, frozen ground. And if that melts, as well as methane hydrates on the seafloor, we're into a very different scenario, into an extinction level type event without being apocalyptic. But all of those 3 types of ice.
Extinction level without meaning to be apocalyptic.
Well, I was trying to be
apocalyptic.
positive, but it is apocalyptic, and it's one of the things the scientists are worried about. But some of these actually generate potential. The melting of sea ice, as you know, generates some economic potential. The other types, the melting of Greenland, the methane release from permafrost, those have potentially very significant economic impacts globally, negative impacts.
Anya, that sounds dramatically more negative than positive, what we just heard from Bernie. Where are you on this?
I believe Madeleine's right. What is happening in terms of climate change is more sort of a shift, a change, because with climate change and melting sea ice, we get more We get more snow in the north. Cambridge Bay is already, which is on the Northwest Passage, a hamlet in Nunavut, has already had 2 or 3 blizzards this season. So the weather is changing, but it's not necessarily in such a way that we're suddenly going to have ice-free winters, not at all. And with increased precipitation, we are going to have new challenges in terms of the built infrastructure. So we need codes and standards in Canada's north that will support increased loads on buildings, for instance. Melting permafrost will buckle roads, it already is. So it's a very gradual and slow process, and it actually impacts the communities more than it impacts business at this point in time.
That's something I suspect, Madeline, people don't know that much about. The weather is changing, but you're getting much more precipitation. Is the North ready for that yet?
It poses a challenge for the municipalities. Here in Iqaluit, we did not actually put a sufficient drainage. So when we do have the ice and the snow beginning to melt in the spring, a lot of it is starting to erode the roads and cause buildings to shift. And there's a lot of costs associated with that. And we just simply do not have the money to deal with those infrastructure issues.
So what do you do?
Well, we've been lobbying the territorial government and the federal government, explaining that we simply are not tax-based economies except for Iqaluit, and that we don't have enough people living in our communities to help pay or offset those costs. And we need all different levels of government working together to address these issues.
Frances, where do you see the greatest potential for economic development in the North?
There's no short answer to that question. I think what we need for the North is a development plan that takes into account how people want to live now. People don't want to leave the communities they're in. They want to continue to harvest. They would like to, overwhelmingly, they would like to be able to live in the North and make their lives there. There is no one industry that can solve that problem. There can be a contribution from mining, both in terms of taxable tax source, can be a source of taxes for governments, can be a source of a certain number of jobs. It's not sufficient to satisfy the needs of the population for waged work. We need to think about diversification and about post-secondary education, because until there's an Arctic university, and a university in Northern Canada, it will be difficult for Northerners to get the education they need to have a modern economy.
Is anybody pitching that right now? I mean, seriously pitching a University of the North somewhere. Madeline, why don't you take that one on?
There are quite a number of us who recognize the value and the need for our Northern University. Ideally, we would like it to be in Iqaluit and Nunavut. Canada is the only Arctic country without a university. We see how beneficial it's been for Greenland, for Alaska, for Russia to have that. It not only contributes to research, but also the business and industry sector benefits from having educated population, but also research that benefits their industries. And it also enables our people, our children, to see that post-secondary education is accessible. I received my law degree in Iqaluit. I didn't have to leave my community. I was able to participate in the economic and political development, and there's a lot of pluses. I'm surprised, and I think it's an embarrassment that Canada does not have a university in its Arctic.
In its Arctic. You're from where originally, Anya?
I'm from Denmark.
Would you consider yourself an Arctic country back in Denmark?
Absolutely, I'm from the Kingdom of Denmark.
You're from the Kingdom of Denmark. Obviously, there are universities in Denmark. Can you imagine, or maybe give us a sense about what we're missing out on by not having post-secondary institutions in the north of Canada?
We have a university in Nuuk. Nuuk is the capital of Greenland. And that university is well attended. It's got instructors from Greenland as well as from Denmark. We have a huge cohort of Greenlanders that go to the university in Nuuk, and they're coming in from the different communities along the west coast. There are subsidy programs, of course, as we have within the Danish welfare state, to support young people going to university in Nuuk. So we are beginning to see a well-educated Greenlandic workforce that will either stay in Greenland or make their mark on the international scene. And in turn, they'll bring economic opportunities and development back to Greenland. Education, and definitely post-secondary education, is in everybody's interest.
Let me talk about those economic opportunities a bit with Bernie. We talked about a second ago the need for a more diversified northern economy. For example, do you see the biggest potential? Would it be in resource extraction? Would it be in shipping? Would it be in tourism? Given the climate changing, where do you see it happening?
It's an excellent question, but as Fran said, it's variable. It depends on what perspective you're asking from. If you're asking what's the best potential for jobs for people who live in the north, then the answer would be slightly different than what are the biggest potential developments for a resource company from the south, for example. A lot has been invested in mining. Shipping is going to be a great enabler. But as Fran also pointed out, there is an infrastructure deficit. So big tourist ships, for example, they cannot go through many parts of the Arctic. We don't have the charts, we don't have the nav aids, and we don't have the ports for them. Currently, I think government is probably the biggest employer of people in the three territories. There are some
Which, the local governments or the government of Canada?
No, sorry, they would be the territorial and local governments. Okay. Yeah. But there are some warning signs on the horizon. For example, the land claim agreements were founded on a notion that the caribou would be around for a long time. And we've had, perhaps again tied to climate change, a very radical drop in the caribou populations. That has an economic impact on local people because of the replacement income generated by hunting caribou. So there are those factors. Education, universities may not be the best way to go in some of the territories simply because the graduation level out of high school isn't sufficiently large. Those universities would probably be populated from people from the south for the most part. And the territorial governments have been looking at these. The Yukon is, I think, more encouraged about a campus there. The Northwest Territories is more hesitant, and I'm not sure what the current position in Nunavut would be on that.
Well, Madeleine, is that a fair criticism, that even if you did establish a University of the North, there wouldn't be an adequate, for lack of a better expression, feeder system of students graduating from secondary school to make up a campus?
We would like to see a university in the north, not only for northerners to attend, but also southerners who are taking Arctic studies. A lot of times we see these southern students come up during the summer for research, and the theories that they've learned in school are actually not that relevant or practical. So we see the value and need to have those southerners learning Arctic studies, whether in geology, biology, nursing, in the northern realities.
The first Prime Minister of Canada, I think it's fair to say, who really took a great interest in the North was John Diefenbaker back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I also think it's fair to say the current Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has been very much inspired by that and has taken an unusually large interest, I say unusually large, unusual compared to other Prime Ministers, in the North as well. You've got a Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency. You've got the chair of the Arctic Council since 2013. You've got an Arctic Economic Council. Let's start with Frances. What do you think of the initiatives of the Harper government as they relate to Canada's North?
Well, I don't agree with you that there's been a big upsurge in interest under this Prime Minister. There, early on in the 2007, 2008, 2009 period, there was a lot of talk, but the money hasn't followed, and there hasn't been a big investment in infrastructure. Another criticism I would have is that there's been very little attempt to work with existing northern governments on the most troublesome longer-term issues, as I see no evidence at all that there's been some work in that area. So there's interest at the rhetorical level. There's clearly a federal interest in northern resources for the national development for the national economy. The Prime Minister has been focused on sovereignty and security issues. But then if you think about, well, what are Northerners' priorities? Developing an innovation capacity that would allow Canada to lead the world in terms of cold weather construction, communication in the Arctic, just to take two examples. Well, we had a basis for doing that, but there's been very little investment in it. And so we're missing a big opportunity to diversify the northern economy and make it stronger through social and technical innovation.
I hear your criticisms, Francis, but when I get to remote parts of Ontario, one of the things that you occasionally hear from people is, oh, those politicians, they never come up here to see us. You know, Stephen Harper does go. Do you give him any credit for that?
He goes annually.
Yeah.
Yes. I think more than, it's excellent that he goes, and I'm glad the North is on his mind. But an annual visit isn't a substitute for leadership in terms of developing the Northern, the social and economic side of the North as Northerners would see their territory developing.
And
So, you know, there's a national interest in the Arctic, that in the North, that we all recognize. It's important for the Canadian economy. It will be more so. But there's also a national interest in building a healthy society in the North. That requires expenditure and leadership.
I should ask Anya whether you agree with Francis's rather negative assessment of this current government's views on the North.
I just think that politics and policy unfolds, it unfolds on many levels. So yes, there's an emphasis on economic development as a driver for the entire country. What we argue at the Conference Board of Canada and the Centre for the North that I represent is that resilient northern communities, that's really what's going to contribute to the national economy. That if you have communities that are bogged down by social issues, problems, low education graduation rates, these sorts of things, you're simply not going to have an economically viable North. So investing in communities and in people who live in those communities, that's going to be part and parcel of driving the northern economy. And if in the end you want to protect Canada's borders and its sovereignty, it really starts at home. So we've looked at some of these pathways to success, and some of them clearly are that you got to get young people interested in themselves and their future. So Aboriginal youth wellness and some of the initiatives that are being rolled out, especially in Nunavut, there are some good examples. Northern Manitoba, Northwest Territories to take a kid trapping, for instance. Those are some of the local initiatives that are really going to make a difference in people's lives.
What do you think, Bernie, in terms of the initiatives of the Conservative government?
I think what confuses a lot of Canadians is what the end game is intended to be, but they have actually made significant expenditures on a range of things. I think the lasting policy initiatives that they have undertaken will be things like devolution. That is a major step.
What's that a reference to?
This is a reference to the transfer of jurisdiction for land and resources. The Yukon got theirs in 2003. The Northwest Territories got theirs in April of 2014, and there's a fast-track process at the moment to negotiate a deal with Nunavut. That's akin to the Prairie provinces getting their natural resource transfers in 1930. And that gives those territorial governments and the people who live in those territories a potential to run their own economy, not to survive simply on transfer payments. So I think there are some big sticker shock items, and the government of Canada for the last 50 years has really been doing municipal level work, schools, nursing stations, that kind of thing. With the loss of sea ice, they've suddenly had to think about those core federal responsibilities, sovereignty, the offshore, the Coast Guard, search and rescue at high latitudes, that kind of thing. And that's where they're being caught flat-footed because we haven't made the incremental infrastructure investments to do that work.
Madeleine, I should get you on the record as well with your views on how you think the Harper government's done on the northern issues.
Definitely a lot more can and should be done. I think that the three levels of government have not necessarily assessed the infrastructure issues and what our priorities are. Quite a number of our communities, the power plants are past their life and are operating in critical condition. Cambridge Bay right now is had to go through quite a number of power rollouts as a result. We would like to see more investment in education, everything from early childhood education through from K to 12, but also post-secondary. We need an educated population in order to take those jobs within the government, whether in tourism, in the fishing sector, in mining. It's getting more and more technical, and the investment has to start with the people, as Anya said earlier.
I wonder, Bernie, you know, the reality is the world is urbanizing. Canada is urbanizing. 85% of the country lives within an hour's drive or 2 hours drive of the U.S. border. We know this already. Most of the populations in the north are very small communities, They're very remote communities. They're very localized economies. What do you think the prospects are as we go further into the 21st century for a part of the country that seems to be in some respects swimming against the tide of the rest of the country and world at the moment?
I'm quite positive about that aspect of it. I think people
I didn't mean it to sound so negative, but you take my point, right?
Well, I think I started with an apocalyptic vision,
Yes, you
so
did.
I take your point. I think the North has a lot of potential. The people are very resilient. They have a range of challenging issues at the moment. Some of them are social. Some of them are driven by external forces. The fact that the whole world is turned up on their doorstep to research and prod and poke them to figure out how they can reinvent Arctic futures. I think if left to their own devices, the people of the North would do quite well. The reality is, if this thing we started with at the beginning, climate change really is engaged globally, then the northern parts of these countries, Canada, Russia, the Scandinavian countries, they are potentially places where people will settle more frequently. And there's a range of options available. Of course, there need to be jobs and industries and whatnot. If the fish stocks are moving north, and there's some scientific doubt as to that, certainly the potential for agriculture in the Mackenzie Valley are higher than they have been for some time. Mm-hmm. Oil and gas resources, we aren't sure about that. Cost and price will be a factor as to whether those are ever developed. But I wouldn't write off the North. I think the North actually is a well-kept secret, because having been raised there myself, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Where were you raised?
I was born in the Northwest Territories, a little town called Fort Smith, but I've lived across the North.
Population of Fort Smith is what?
At that point, it was about 200. I think it's about 15 or 1,800 now.
How does it survive?
That's a good question. There are local economies, and people reach a critical size, and there are certain services. And of course, as I pointed out, people do still use the resources from the land to the extent that they're there. Caribou loss is a huge problem for us in the Western Arctic. But as a tourist destination, some of those kind of out-of-the-box solutions, I'm not sure they're drummed up to be. But as I said, I think the northern part of this planet is certainly not going to go away in terms of importance for people to live.
Not go away, and still clearly important to the rest of the country in many respects. But Francis, again, to the question that I asked Bernie, do you worry that the direction that most of the world is going in right now is not the same direction that the North is going in?
No, no. I think here I would make the point first that Canada is one of the most concentrated, has one of the most concentrated populations in the world, I think, along with Australia. So our country is in a funny position. We do have more than, I think it's close to 98% of the population live within 500 kilometers of the US border. It's a little crowded down here. If you drive outside of your city, Toronto, you'll see, mostly farmland is covered with simple development. If you go north, you find beautiful landscape, you find friendly people, you find small communities, you find fresh air. There are lots of reasons for people to want to move to the north and live there. It's a lovely place to live, right across the north. I think what Bernie said is very important, that as the globe begins to feel the effects of climate change, we're going to know what it's like to receive climate change refugees. That's probably already starting now. It's going to get greater and greater. Seems to me that we need to think about what kind of society do we want to build in the mid-north, that's the band of the provincial norths below the territories, and in the territorial north to accommodate what will be a growing number of people who want to live here, because the effects of climate change in Canada, it appears, will be less severe than they are in places where desertification and radical climate change is going to make it hard for people to live there.
Francis, I had not heard that expression before, climate change refugees. Do I infer from that you think people from all over the world are going to come to settle in Canada's north because the rest of the world will be just unlivable?
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how sudden that will be, but it seems to me very likely. We have a vast country. We have a big country with lots of geography. There are many beautiful places to live that could hold more people. And there will be growing numbers of people who have nowhere to live elsewhere. So it seems likely there will be pressure.
Madeline, how about you on that issue of whether or not the North is adequately situated or positioned to participate in the increasingly complicated 21st century economy?
Well, there are things like Baffinland, which is going to be, or proposed to be, one of the largest mines in North America when it gets up to full operation. And right now, a lot of those mines, historically and currently, are shipping in people from the south or to work there. And similarly, we have at least 50% of our territorial government have southern people working in the north. We have resources. There are opportunities. I agree with Bernie and with Francis that it is difficult. And we have a mixed land-based economy. It's important to realize that a lot of our people are working in the construction during the summer season, then they're working in fishing, or they're working in arts and crafts, and they're also hunting and providing for their family. And so you can have a single person receiving 4 or 5 different sources of income over the course of a year. And there needs to be that flexibility and that support in place to allow it. The North is different, and we need to have different ways in which to support people.
How much, in your view, Anya, does the traditional economy matter?
Matters a lot. And one also has to think of the North as a number of nations. So just in Canada alone, we have Inuit living in different parts of the country. We have 4 regions which make up sort of the Inuit homeland in Canada. And then we have the Inuit Circumpolar Council with Inuit from 4 of the circumpolar nations. These are all historical ties that sort of that continue to this day and function in the modern world. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council is part of the Arctic Council, and Inuit assert their influence internationally as well as locally. So when you talk about is the North are the places in the North too far-flung to make a difference in the Canadian international economy? Well, not at all, because you think about it in a way that's too linear. You also have to think about it in terms of nations, Aboriginal peoples, how they for centuries have collaborated across what we today have as boundaries, but they are artificial to most of the people that live in the circumpolar region. So think of the circumpolar region as a bigger nation, populated by us as well, the immigrants that have come to the North.
But not enough of us.
Not enough of us?
Well, you'd rather have more than 100,000 people living in the North, wouldn't you?
I guess
to be truly sustainable, you'd want a larger population, I presume. I mean, that's a lot of what we've been talking about today.
Well, have you ever been to Iqaluit? And maybe I'm speaking for Madeline here, but the dump was burning for 4 months. I mean, garbage is piling up. We need processes in the North that can accommodate more people coming in. And this is where Madeline's point about collaboration between the 3 levels of government, especially around critical infrastructure, is going to be so important, because if we don't have those systems in place and we bring more people in, we're going to see environmental degradation, we're going to see pollution, we're going to see a lot of different things that we're more capable of handling in the South, but for which we do not currently have the systems in the North. I mean, both Nunavut and the Northwest Territories are off the main grid. So, I mean, etc. There are no roads in Nunavut. And most of the communities or many of the communities in the Northwest Territories are fly-in communities. Yeah. The Yukon has road access, except for Oak Crow. So you got to bear that in mind before you start. I mean, there has to be a sequence of events here. And I would definitely want to see a pristine North rather than an overdeveloped North.
So, Madeline, the notion of sort of hoping that 50,000 people over the next decade move to the North isn't ready for that yet anyway, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, even in Iqaluit, with the growth of about 300 new residents every year, the city struggles to actually have sufficient lots to have additional residences built or lots available for the new offices that both the the three different levels of government continue to open. So it actually also poses a tremendous challenge on the community and the people of my community, because you're having such an influx of newcomers, and there can be tensions, not only racially, but also with the different socioeconomic classes. When you have a whole bunch of newcomers coming in and taking jobs that the locals are not educated to take, those tensions sometimes, unfortunately, can get quite ugly.
How much self-determination do you see right now? Actually, before I ask you that, where do you live now?
Currently, I live in Ottawa.
Are you not like a typical example of Northern Exodus? Here's a guy who, in order to pursue his self-determination, left. There's a lot of that, isn't there?
There is a lot of that. In fact, the Northwest Territories is undergoing somewhat of a depopulation. I know Minister Milton Berger was looking for a couple thousand more residents to move north in the near future. I came out actually for northern reasons. I moved to Ottawa because I was working with the government of the Northwest Territories on a range of constitutional issues that took me to Ottawa. And as luck would have it, well, in Ottawa, I got engaged in international Arctic work, and it made more sense to fly from Ottawa than to fly from Yellowknife or Iqaluit or wherever I happen to be living. So I'm certainly a northerner by birth and disposition, and all of my professional work goes back into the north. For travel reasons, I'm located in the south.
There is an irony in that, though,
There is
right?
an irony
in order
in that.
to pursue, in order to do your thing for the north,
It was
you actually
better to
live
be
along
in the
what-
south.
It's better to be in the south.
Yeah, and I'm sure that is true for quite a few people. I would say, though, there are a lot more opportunities in some of the larger centers in the north, in the White Horses, the Yellowknife, the Iqaluits. The challenge is really around the economy, creating those opportunities at the community level, so that people can live where they want to live and they can make a living where they want to live. And those are the challenges, and there is some possibility that, in the information age, we could see a future where that would be possible. But I think the North, as I said, is a place that will become more important. If nothing else, it has a lot of fresh water, and human beings can't drink oil and gas. They need to drink water, and the water resources alone in the Arctic and in the high north are very important.
Madeline, can I just ask you a very simple question? That being, why do you like living there?
It's home. It's where I was born. It's where my family is. Iqaluit is extremely busy and dynamic. There's so much that's happening here, both at the local, regional, territorial, national, international level. There's so much happening on the political and social level. I love it. It's home.
But if it
I can't
weren't-
imagine living anywhere else for right now.
That's-
But I do understand why Bernie does live in the South. The cost of living is significantly cheaper. It's easier to work on Arctic issues from Ottawa in that respect. But then I feel that it's too easy to get disconnected unless you actually maintain those relationships and spend quite a bit of time here.
So part of the reason you live there is because, never mind that you love it there, but it's home. If it weren't home, is it a place that you can imagine, if you were from the South, moving to?
There's a lot of people who do come up here to work. Most of them are for only 2 to 3 years, but there are a few that love it and end up living here for 10, 15, 20 years. What usually happens is that even the long-timers eventually leave the North when it does come to retirement age, simply because the cost of living is too much. Of course, if you're local and you retire here, unfortunately, things like, people the elders lose their homes and they end up living with family, 3, 4 generations living in a house. That causes a lot of tensions, a lot of problems, and unfortunately leads to, sometimes people harming themselves or harming others in their own family unit because of it.
I mean, Anya, the reality of mass media today is that it tends to focus on the negative, and you hear the disaster stories before you hear, for example, the good things that Madeline just told us about. But why do you think it would be a good thing to live in the North?
In the north, the sky's the limit in many ways.
It's very true.
Especially in the summer, the sky's the limit. And the north is actually today an incubator for all types of solutions. You have engineering ingenuity coming out of the north. The building of the highway from Inuvik to Tuk in the Northwest Territories. Now that's going to be a feat on its own.
How long is that going to be?
How long is
The
that?
length of the highway.
147 kilometers.
Going from where to where?
From Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk. Tuk.
How long is that going to take to build?
I'm not sure what the construction period is, but
Do I assume there's a huge chunk of the year where you can't build at all?
No, exactly. I believe that the engineering company is probably working all year round and have technologies in place that will ensure that they won't really stop for any period of time. I don't know specifically what they're doing, but the highway is going to get built. So that in itself poses a lot of technical and engineering challenges, and those are coming out of the north. What we're not particularly good at is harnessing those innovative solutions and exporting them as our own. Look at Norway with Svalbard, look at Denmark with Greenland, look at Northern Scandinavia, Finland in particular, their shipping industry, look at Russia with Rosneft. They're all over the map.
Do people in the north care what people in the south think of them?
Yes and no. I think everybody cares about what other people think of them. I think there's a huge misperception in the South about the ingenuity of the North and the resiliency of Northerners, and that's because things are simply not communicated well. At the Conference Board of Canada, establishing the Centre for the North, improving that dialogue was one of the main purposes of the centre, and we have consistently been looking for innovative solutions to feature in the reports that we've put out, whether it's been on education, Aboriginal youth wellness, transportation, marine shipping, etc., always from the perspective of the glass half full.
Well, Frances, if we were to reconvene this group in 25 years, let's say, what kind of a different North would we be talking about 25 years from now? How would things be different?
Well, my dream would be that you'd be based in the North, producing this program from there. You'd have a staff who were trained locally in broadcast technology, and that people all over the North would be able to participate in the discussion.
Got to get more broadband, don't you?
Yes.
More broadband in the North would help a lot, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
Yeah. Infrastructure is the theme of this conversation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Bernie, how about you? 25 years from now, how different might the North look?
Well, I think it definitely will look different. There may be more broadband. Certainly the government of the Northwest Territories is currently trying to build a fiber optic pipe down the Mackenzie Valley that would go to Inuvik to create a large satellite farm there. And there would be offshoots to the community. So some of that communication infrastructure might be in place. I think what will be striking in the next 25 years is the fact that the people of the North, if devolution is in place in all three territories, will be making their own economic decisions. They will be having the debates about mines and pipelines and oil and gas and not fisheries so much in the offshore. But that is a very significant thing. If all of the land claim settlements are in place, there are three outstanding ones, I think, in the Northwest Territories, but Nunavut and the Yukon are done. You're looking at a very dynamic population. And I think what distresses me is how much the rest of the world is looking into the North and trying to reinvent the North's future. There's a perception globally, nationally, that there's a big vacuum in the North and that we need to come up with systems of governance. And so you and I could attend a conference probably every day of the year somewhere in the world where the issue of Arctic governance is on the table. But that's the outside looking in. And these places, if they are making their own decisions, will, I think, take the North in a direction that we can actually all be proud of. Because although they are challenged with only, let's say, 35,000 people in Nunavut, they are currently running 25 communities, 25 schools, 25 nursing stations, and so on. And they're doing it with a remarkably small number of people. So it's not a failure, they're a huge success in many ways.
Madeline, how about you? 25 years from now, what are we going to be talking about?
Well, I hope, like Frances says, that actually this program would be being hosted from the North and with lots of Northerners participating with each other as well as with Southerners. It does require vision and resources and a lot of work and effort to get there. I don't think that we should assume that things are automatically better with on their own or just over time. I would like to see that the land claim agreements are honored and respected. I'd like to see good governance at all levels and the more collaboration and what's happening in the north is beneficial for the Northerners, but also for all of Canada.
Madeline, I'll make you a deal. If you can manage to get the Hamilton Tiger Cats to move to Iqaluit, I'll move to Iqaluit too.
I don't know how they would feel about that, but we could make that proposal.
Okay, let's work on that together. I want to thank all of you for coming in today and really shedding a lot of light on a part of the country that we don't think about enough, I would suggest, down here in the South. Madeline Redfern, the former mayor of Iqaluit, now president of, I love the name of your company, Ayungi Arctic Consulting Group. Ayungi meaning?
Resourceful, clever, helpful.
Perfect. Frances Abel, Professor of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University in Ottawa. Thanks, Frances. And here in our studio, Anya Jeffrey, Director, Northern Aboriginal Policy for the Conference Board of Canada, and Bernard Funston, President, Northern Canada Consulting, past chair of the Canadian Polar Commission. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.